Imagine stepping into your classroom eager to share your thoughts, only to discover that your teacher views you not as a student, but as someone inferior. This is the tale of Jamal, a bright young student who encountered bullying from a teacher who should have been mentoring him. Instead, it's a narrative of resilience, bravery, and standing up against unfairness. Before we delve into the story, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Please share your location in the comments below. Now, let's begin the story. Jamal stood outside the tall iron gates of Rosewood High, a prestigious institution recognized for its academic excellence and competitive atmosphere. It marked the beginning of his junior year, and the warm morning sun provided the perfect backdrop for his anticipation. Jamal had grand aspirations of becoming a doctor, and this year felt like a crucial step toward realizing that dream. He adjusted his backpack and took a deep breath, prepared for what he believed would be another fruitful year. Jamal had always been diligent. He spent most of his time either studying or assisting his mother at home. His family wasn't affluent, but they valued education, and Jamal took pride in being one of the top students at Rosewood. The school was renowned for producing future leaders, doctors, and lawyers, and he felt he was on the right track. His peers respected him for his intellect and kind demeanor, even if he wasn't the most vocal or outgoing individual in the room. As Jamal navigated through the bustling hallway, he felt a sense of determination. This year he intended to excel even further. He wanted to impress his teachers, excel in all his subjects, and prepare for his forthcoming college applications. Medicine had always captivated him, and he spent countless hours studying biology and chemistry, hoping one day to apply that knowledge to assist others. His teachers always held high expectations for him, and he was resolute not to disappoint them. After maneuvering through the crowded corridors, Jamal finally reached his first class of the day, history. History had always been one of his favorite subjects. He enjoyed exploring different cultures and events that shaped the world. He loved how history connected the past with the present, and he was eager to delve into the material this year. However, something felt amiss. As he entered the classroom, it was unusually quiet, with students sitting rigidly at their desks. There was a peculiar tension in the air that Jamal couldn't quite identify. His usual excitement was replaced with a strange discomfort. He noticed some of his classmates exchanging anxious glances. As he made his way to his seat near the center of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Then the door swung open, and the new history teacher, Miss Harper, entered. She was a tall, stern-looking woman in her early 30s, with sharp features and an air of authority. Her cold, penetrating gaze swept across the room as if she were assessing each student. There was no warmth in her eyes, no friendly smile, just a rigid expression that made everyone sit a little straighter in their seats. Jamal had heard rumors about Miss Harper before the school year commenced. Some students claimed she was strict but fair, while others suggested she was impossible to satisfy. Her reputation as a demanding teacher preceded her, but Jamal wasn't overly concerned. He had always performed well in school and believed he could handle any challenge. After all, he was accustomed to hard work. Still, there was something unsettling about her presence that he couldn't quite dismiss. Miss Harper walked to the front of the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She didn't bother with introductions or niceties. Instead, she launched straight into a lecture about classroom rules and expectations, her tone clipped and precise. Jamal listened attentively, but he couldn't help but notice how her gaze lingered on him every time she mentioned discipline or poor performance. It was subtle, but it was there a coldness that made his skin crawl. As Miss Harper continued her speech, Jamal's discomfort deepened. She stressed that she had zero tolerance for students who didn't meet her standards. She warned them about the repercussions of falling behind, making it clear that she wouldn't hesitate to fail anyone who didn't keep pace. Her words were sharp and direct, leaving little room for interpretation. It was evident that she intended to run her classroom with an iron grip. Jamal glanced around the room. His classmates seemed equally uneasy, shifting in their seats and avoiding eye contact with the teacher. There was no room for errors in Miss Harper's class, no space for second chances. Jamal felt the weight of her expectations settling heavily on his shoulders, but he reassured himself that he could manage it. He had encountered tough teachers before, and he had always emerged victorious. As the first week of classes progressed, Jamal attempted to concentrate on his studies. He dedicated extra hours to understanding the material and ensuring he grasped every detail of the lessons. He didn't want to give Miss Harper any reason to target him. But despite his efforts, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was scrutinizing him more closely than the other students. She seldom called on him in class, and when she did, her tone was always sharp, as if she anticipated his failure. During one particular lesson, Miss Harper assigned a group project. Jamal was paired with two of his classmates, and they quickly divided the tasks. Jamal, being the diligent student he was, finished his part ahead of schedule and shared it with his group. However, when they presented their work in front of the class, Miss Harper barely acknowledged Jamal's contribution. Instead, she praised his groupmates for their efforts and criticized Jamal for being too passive. Jamal was bewildered. He had completed his share just like everyone else, but Miss Harper made it seem as if he hadn't contributed at all. The other students appeared uncomfortable with the situation, but no one spoke up. Jamal didn't know how to react. He had never been treated this way by a teacher before. As the days turned into weeks, Miss Harper's cold demeanor toward Jamal became increasingly noticeable. She would often dismiss his ideas in class, interrupting him before he could fully articulate his thoughts. She marked his assignments more harshly than those of his peers, and when he sought feedback, she provided vague responses that didn't help him improve. It felt as if she was intentionally trying to undermine him, but Jamal couldn't comprehend why. One afternoon, after yet another harsh critique of his work, Jamal decided to stay after class to speak with Miss Harper. He wanted to understand what he was doing wrong and how he could improve. As the last of his classmates exited the room, Jamal approached her desk, his heart racing. "Miss Harper, may I speak with you for a moment?" he asked, attempting to maintain his composure. She looked up from her papers, her expression inscrutable. "What is it, Jamal? I've noticed that my grades in this class aren't where I'd like them to be, and I was hoping you could provide me with some advice on how I can improve," he said, choosing his words carefully. Miss Harper stared at him for a moment, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Do better?" she repeated, her tone laced with sarcasm. "You need to learn your place, Jamal. This is a challenging class, and not everyone is suited for it. Perhaps you should focus on something more within your reach." Jamal felt a lump form in his throat. Her words stung, but more than that, they perplexed him. He had always been one of the top students at Rosewood, so why was she treating him this way? He had never encountered anything like this before. This wasn't about his performance, it felt personal. As Jamal left the classroom that day, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was profoundly wrong. His enthusiasm for the new school year had been replaced with anxiety. He didn't know why Miss Harper had singled him out, but he knew one thing for certain. This year was going to be far more challenging than he had expected. As the days passed, Jamal began to notice small things about Miss Harper's behavior that left him feeling unsettled. At first, he thought it was merely in his head. Small, subtle actions that might not even mean anything. When he raised his hand to answer questions, she would look right past him, calling on other students instead. Sometimes she'd walk by his desk during class discussions and glance at his notes without saying a word, then move on as if he didn't exist. The first few times it happened, Jamal brushed it off. Maybe she was busy, or perhaps she simply didn't notice him. But after a while, it became harder to ignore. One day, the class was engaged in a group discussion about key historical events, and Jamal raised his hand to share his thoughts. Miss Harper glanced at him, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't quite identify, then turned away to call on a student sitting a few rows behind him. Jamal's hand slowly lowered, his heart sinking a bit. This had happened before, but each time it stung just a little more. His thoughts were always well researched, and he enjoyed participating, but it seemed like Miss Harper was determined to exclude him. It wasn't just the lack of acknowledgement that troubled Jamal. Over time, he realized she was dismissive when he asked questions. Once, during a lesson on World War II, Jamal sought clarification about a point she made regarding economic impacts after the war. Miss Harper provided a brief, almost disinterested response and moved on without further explanation. Meanwhile, when other students asked questions, sometimes even about simple, obvious things, she would take the time to explain in detail, often with a smile or nod of encouragement. Initially, Jamal told himself he might be overthinking it. Maybe Miss Harper was just tough on everyone. He knew she had a reputation for being strict, and perhaps this was just her teaching style. But as more time passed, he began to see a pattern. It wasn't merely about him feeling ignored, It was about how she treated the other students compared to him. Some students could make a passing comment in class, and Miss Harper would praise them for their insight, sometimes even congratulating them on a point that seemed trivial. But no matter how hard Jamal worked, or how thoughtful his contributions were, Miss Harper never acknowledged him in the same manner. It felt like his efforts were invisible to her. Things took a more troubling turn regarding his graded assignments. For weeks, Jamal had been submitting all his homework on time, meticulously checking each one to ensure it met Miss Harper's high standards. Yet for some reason, his assignments were often misplaced or delayed, while other students received their work back promptly. Jamal would sit waiting for his grades long after the others. When he inquired about his missing assignments, Miss Harper would simply tell him, "I must have misplaced it," or "I'll get to it when I have time," without any sense of urgency. It was frustrating, but what could he do? He didn't want to come across as disrespectful or create a scene. Then one afternoon, Miss Harper returned a significant essay project Jamal had spent hours working on, carefully crafting each paragraph and reviewing his sources. He was proud of his work, confident that it was well written. As Miss Harper walked around the room, returning the essays, she complimented several students on their efforts. When she finally reached Jamal's desk, she simply placed his paper in front of him without a word, no grade. Just a blank, untouched essay, as if she hadn't even bothered to review it. Jamal stared at the paper, feeling a lump form in his throat. How could this be happening? Why was she treating him differently? He flipped through the pages, hoping to find some note or comment, but there was nothing. It was as if his hard work didn't matter to her. Over the next few weeks, Miss Harper's behavior toward Jamal grew worse. In class discussions, she began making little remarks aimed at him, often cutting him off before he could finish his thoughts. During a debate on civil rights, Jamal was explaining his perspective on Martin Luther King Jr.'s approach to nonviolence, when Miss Harper interrupted him mid-sentence. "That's a nice idea, Jamal," she said with a condescending smile, "but I'm not sure you fully understand the complexities of the situation. Let's hear from someone else." The way she spoke to him made Jamal feel small, as if his thoughts were inconsequential. And it wasn't just the words she used, it was the tone. There was a sharpness in her voice, an underlying edge that made him feel mocked. It wasn't just about disagreeing with his ideas. It was about ensuring he felt like his ideas weren't worth considering. Jamal's classmates began to notice the tension too. A few of them gave him sympathetic glances after Miss Harper's harsh remarks, but no one ever voiced their concerns. They likely didn't want to get on Miss Harper's bad side either. Some of them even tried to include Jamal more in group discussions or projects, as if to make up for how he was being treated in class. But no matter how much support Jamal received from his peers, the sting of Miss Harper's words and actions cut deeper with each passing day. What hurt the most wasn't just the dismissive comments or ignored questions. It was the sense that Miss Harper harbored some personal grudge against him. It was difficult to comprehend. Jamal had never been in trouble, never caused any disruptions in class. In fact, he always tried his best to be respectful and hardworking. So why did Miss Harper seem to single him out so negatively? Was it something he said? Was there some mistake he made that he didn't realize? No matter how hard he tried to reflect, he couldn't come up with a reason for her hostility. The realization hit him one afternoon after yet another class where Miss Harper belittled him in front of the students. She had made a sarcastic comment about his interpretation of a historical event, suggesting that perhaps he didn't quite grasp the nuance that the other students did. As Jamal sat in his seat staring at his notebook, it dawned on him. This wasn't about his performance or understanding of the material. This was about something deeper. The way she looked at him, the way her tone shifted whenever she spoke to him. It was different from how she treated the other students. The sinking feeling in his stomach told him what he didn't want to admit. Miss Harper wasn't just a tough teacher who didn't like him. She was targeting him. And the more he thought about it, the clearer it became. It was in the way she dismissed him, the way she avoided engaging with him, unless it was to criticize or belittle him. There was something about Jamal that Miss Harper didn't like, and the only thing that stood out to him was his race. The weight of that realization pressed down on Jamal. Racism was something he had learned about in history class, something that seemed far removed from his everyday life. But now it was happening to him. He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was there. Miss Harper treated him differently not because of his academic performance, but because of who he was. This wasn't just unfair. It was something much worse. Jamal tried to figure out what to do next. He could tell someone, perhaps his guidance counselor or another teacher. But what if they didn't believe him? Miss Harper was well respected at the school, and Jamal wasn't sure how people would react if he accused her of something so serious. He didn't want to create trouble for himself, or make things even harder in her class. But at the same time, he knew he couldn't keep enduring the subtle jabs, the dismissive remarks, and the unjust treatment. Something had to change. As the weeks dragged on, Jamal wrestled with the growing sense of isolation. Miss Harper's behavior persisted, her comments more cutting, her dismissals more frequent. He knew now that it wasn't his imagination. It was real, and it wasn't going to stop unless he took action. But what? One overcast afternoon, the class was deep into a lesson on the civil rights movement. It was a topic that had always held special significance for Jamal, who admired the courage and perseverance of leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X. He had spent extra time researching the movement, fascinated by how ordinary people had fought for their rights and changed the course of history. When Miss Harper asked for thoughts on the subject, Jamal felt a surge of confidence. He raised his hand, eager to share his perspective. This time he hoped things would be different. Miss Harper's eyes flicked toward him, and for a brief moment Jamal thought she might finally acknowledge him. But then she smirked. It was a cruel, dismissive expression that sent a chill down his spine. Slowly, she crossed her arms and raised an eyebrow. "Jamal," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "do you really think you understand the complexity of the civil rights movement, or are you just repeating what you've heard?" The words hung in the air like a weight, pulling the room into a tense silence. Jamal blinked, caught off guard. His throat tightened as the eyes of his classmates turned toward him. Miss Harper didn't stop there. "I'm just curious," she continued, her tone sharp and mocking. "Do you even grasp the deeper historical context? People like you often don't." The room fell utterly still. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest as the humiliation washed over him. He could feel his classmates watching, but no one spoke up. No one came to his defense. Jamal sat frozen, trying to process what had just transpired. He had known Miss Harper was tough on him, but this was different. This wasn't just a critique of his academic performance. It was a personal attack. Miss Harper turned her back to him as though the conversation were over and began scribbling notes on the board. The lesson continued, but Jamal's mind was elsewhere. His thoughts raced as he replayed her words over and over in his head. "People like you?" What did that mean? The implication was clear, but Jamal struggled to accept that it was happening. He had always heard about racial discrimination, but to experience it so openly, so directly, was shocking, and the sting of it hit harder than he ever imagined. From that day on, things escalated quickly. Miss Harper's hostility, once subtle and dismissive, became overt and aggressive. During a discussion about the Harlem Renaissance, Jamal attempted to share his thoughts on the significance of the art and literature that emerged from the movement. Before he could finish his point, Miss Harper cut him off. "That's enough, Jamal. We don't need a lecture from you on something you probably don't even fully understand." The comment was sharp, and it landed with force. Jamal's stomach twisted. He felt small, as if every word he spoke was being dissected and torn apart. Miss Harper didn't even bother to hide her disdain anymore. She would roll her eyes when he spoke or sigh dramatically, making it clear to the entire class that she had no respect for his ideas. What made it worse was the fact that no one else was treated this way. She praised other students for their contributions, encouraged them to speak up, but for Jamal there was only coldness and ridicule. It wasn't just in discussions that Miss Harper targeted him. She began singling him out for the smallest infractions. If he was even a minute late to class, she would call him out in front of everyone, accusing him of not taking his education seriously. One day, when Jamal was quietly working on an assignment, Miss Harper stood over his shoulder, watching him with an icy glare. "You better hope you don't mess this one up," she said quietly, but loud enough for the nearby students to hear. "I don't expect much from you anyway." Jamal's confidence began to crack under the relentless pressure. He had always taken pride in his academic achievements, but now he started second-guessing everything he did. He worried about every answer he gave in class, terrified of being humiliated again. When he received his assignments back, Miss Harper's feedback was always harsh, nitpicking at details that didn't seem significant. Even when he knew he had performed well, she found ways to undermine his work. The bright future he had envisioned for himself, The dream of becoming a doctor seemed to dim with each passing day. Jamal's friends noticed the change in him. He wasn't as self-assured as he used to be. In the hallways, he kept his head down, avoiding eye contact with teachers and classmates alike. He didn't speak up in other classes as much, worried that he might draw unwanted attention. It was as if Miss Harper's words had planted seeds of doubt in his mind, and those seeds had begun to take root. One afternoon, after yet another humiliating comment in front of the class, Jamal lingered behind after the bell rang. He stared at his notebook, unable to move, feeling the weight of Miss Harper's insults bearing down on him. His hands trembled as he packed his belongings, and for a moment he thought about approaching the principal, or at least telling his guidance counselor what had been happening. But every time he considered it, a voice in his head stopped him. What if they didn't believe him? Miss Harper was the daughter of the principal, after all. She was well-connected, respected. He was just a student worse, a black student. Would anyone even care? The weeks dragged on, and the emotional toll of being targeted by Miss Harper began to wear Jamal down. He started losing sleep, his mind racing at night as he replayed every harsh remark, every demeaning comment. He'd wake up in the early hours of the morning, exhausted but dreading the thought of going to school. His grades, once stellar, began to decline. He couldn't concentrate in class, couldn't summon the energy to study as he used to. It was as if a dark cloud had settled over him, and no matter what he did, he couldn't shake it. One day, during a particularly tense class, Jamal made a minor mistake on a quiz. It wasn't a big deal. He had missed one question out of several. But when Miss Harper handed back the papers, she made a point of singling him out. "Jamal, you really need to step it up," she said loudly, drawing the attention of the entire class. "If you can't even get the basics right, maybe this class is too advanced for you." Jamal sat frozen, his face burning with shame. He wanted to defend himself, to point out that he had only missed one question, but the words caught in his throat. What was the point? Miss Harper wouldn't listen. She had already made up her mind about him. As the class moved on, Jamal's thoughts drifted. He wondered how things had come to this. He had always believed that if he worked hard enough, if he stayed focused and did his best, he could achieve anything. But now he wasn't so sure. Miss Harper's words echoed in his mind, eroding the confidence he had built over the years. For the first time in his life, Jamal felt truly defeated. His friends tried to uplift him, but there was only so much they could do. They saw what was happening but were powerless to stop it. Some of them suggested that he should report Miss Harper to the school administration, but Jamal wasn't sure if that would improve things or make them worse. What if Miss Harper found out? What if the school sided with her? After all, her father was the principal. The pressure continued to build, and Jamal found himself sinking deeper into despair. The bullying wasn't just about the words Miss Harper used. It was about how she made him feel like he didn't belong, like no matter how hard he tried, it would never be enough. He had always believed in the power of education, but now he wasn't sure what to believe. Every day felt like a battle, and Jamal wasn't sure how much longer he could keep fighting. Jamal had reached his breaking point. The constant insults, the degrading remarks, and the open hostility from Miss Harper were becoming intolerable. Every morning he dreaded entering history class, knowing he would be the target of yet another public humiliation. His confidence had all but vanished, and it was impacting every aspect of his life: his grades, his friendships, even his sense of self-worth. He couldn't continue like this. Something had to change. One afternoon, after a particularly rough day in class, Jamal made a decision. He couldn't remain silent any longer. Miss Harper had crossed too many boundaries, and if he didn't speak up now, she would keep getting away with it. He needed help, and the first person who came to mind was his guidance counselor, Mr. Simmons. Mr. Simmons had always seemed like a supportive and approachable person, someone who genuinely cared about the students. If anyone could assist him, it would be Mr. Simmons. After school, Jamal walked down the quiet hallway toward the guidance office. His heart raced as he approached the door, a mix of nerves and determination swirling within him. He wasn't sure how this conversation would unfold, but he knew he had to try. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door and stepped inside. When Mr. Simmons called out, "Come in," he looked up from his desk, smiling warmly. "Jamal, what can I do for you?" Jamal hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to start. But then the weight of everything he'd been carrying surged to the surface. "I need to talk to you about something serious," Jamal said, his voice low but steady. "It's about Miss Harper." Mr. Simmons raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting to one of mild concern. "Miss Harper? What's going on?" Jamal took a seat, his hands clasped tightly in his lap as he tried to organize his thoughts. "She's been treating me differently," he began, his voice growing more assured as he spoke. "It started off small, but now it's gotten really bad. She's making these comments in class about me, about my race. She's belittling me in front of everyone. And it's not just once or twice, it's every day. I can't take it anymore." For a moment, there was silence as Mr. Simmons listened, his expression unreadable. Jamal watched, hoping for a sign of understanding, some reassurance that he had come to the right person. But what he saw instead was a flicker of hesitation. "Jamal," Mr. Simmons began slowly, leaning back in his chair. "Miss Harper has been teaching here for a long time. She's known for being tough on her students, but she's also highly respected by the faculty. I'm not saying what you're experiencing isn't real, but are you sure this isn't just her teaching style?" Jamal felt his stomach drop. "Her teaching style?" he echoed, disbelief creeping into his voice. "This isn't about being tough on students. She's making racist comments, singling me out for things no one else gets called out for. She's bullying me." Mr. Simmons nodded, but there was a cautious look in his eyes. "I understand that you're upset, Jamal, and I take your concerns seriously, but sometimes teachers have different ways of pushing their students to do better. I've heard from others that Miss Harper can be strict, but no one's ever accused her of anything like this before." Jamal felt his frustration mounting. "So because no one else has spoken up, I'm supposed to just ignore what's happening? This isn't just about being strict. She's treating me like I don't belong here, like I'm not good enough because of who I am." "Mr. Simmons sighed, glancing down at the papers on his desk as if searching for the right words. "I hear what you're saying, Jamal, but Miss Harper is the principal's daughter. It's a tricky situation. I would advise you to try to stay focused on your studies. Don't let anyone get in your way, even if it feels unfair. Sometimes we just have to rise above these challenges." Jamal rose from his seat, his chest heavy with disappointment. "Thanks for your time," he muttered, his voice thick with defeat. He didn't wait for a response as he walked out of the office, the door clicking shut behind him. As he made his way down the hallway, a wave of hopelessness washed over him. He had tried to do the right thing, to report what was happening, but no one seemed willing to listen. The counselor's words echoed in his mind. Miss Harper was the principal's daughter, a respected teacher. Who was Jamal in comparison? Just a student, and one who was now being told to ignore the negativity. The next few days at school felt even heavier. Jamal went through the motions, showing up to class and trying to keep his head down. But Miss Harper's behavior only worsened. It was as though she sensed his failed attempt to report her and had become even more emboldened. She seized every opportunity to belittle him, whether it was in front of his peers or in the privacy of graded assignments. In one class, she handed back a test with a sneer. "I'm not surprised by these results, Jamal," she said loudly, ensuring everyone heard. "This is exactly what I expected from someone like you." Jamal's cheeks burned with shame as his classmates glanced at him, some whispering among themselves. He looked down at his paper, fighting the urge to crumple it in his hands. The grade wasn't even bad. It was average. But the way Miss Harper framed it made it feel like a failure. Her comments about his race became more frequent, slipping into conversations where they had no place. When the class discussed social issues, Miss Harper would subtly steer the conversation in a way that made Jamal feel like he was under a microscope. "Not everyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps," she'd say, glancing in his direction, her tone dripping with condescension. "Some people are just held back by circumstances." Jamal's anger and frustration grew with each passing day, but he felt trapped. The administration wasn't going to help him, the teachers wouldn't intervene, and his classmates were too afraid to speak up. He was alone in this, and it was a crushing realization. Despite his attempts to stay focused, Miss Harper's relentless harassment was taking a toll. His grades, once a source of pride, began to slip. He found it hard to concentrate, constantly on edge, waiting for the next insult or degrading comment. The emotional toll was overwhelming. The school, which had once felt like a place of opportunity, now felt like a prison he couldn't escape from. But what hurt the most wasn't just Miss Harper's words. It was the silence that followed. The silence from the school, from the counselor who dismissed his concerns, from the classmates who looked the other way. Jamal felt invisible, as if his pain didn't matter to anyone but himself. It was as though the walls around him were closing in, and no one was willing to reach out a hand to pull him out. With each passing day, the weight of the school's ignorance grew heavier on Jamal's shoulders, and he couldn't help but wonder how much longer he could carry it. It had been a week since Jamal had spoken to the guidance counselor, and the situation in class was deteriorating daily. Miss Harper seemed to be relishing her power over him, going out of her way to make him feel small. The taunts, the snide comments, the dismissive looks, it had become a daily routine. But Jamal had always prided himself on his resilience. No matter how hard things got, he had learned to push through, to keep going. He wasn't going to let Miss Harper destroy what he had worked so hard for. The upcoming class presentation was Jamal's chance to reclaim his confidence. The assignment was on significant historical events, and Jamal had been given the topic of the Montgomery bus boycott. He had spent days researching, putting together what he thought was a compelling presentation. The story of Rosa Parks' defiance and the community's struggle for civil rights resonated deeply with him. He knew this was his opportunity to show Miss Harper and the entire class that he was more than capable, that he wasn't the person Miss Harper tried to make him out to be. The morning of the presentation, Jamal woke up early, reviewing his notes one last time. He rehearsed in front of the mirror, practicing his delivery, imagining how the class would react to his passion for the subject. By the time he entered history class, he felt prepared, nervous, but ready. Miss Harper sat at her desk, shuffling through papers as the class settled in. The atmosphere was tense, as always, but Jamal forced himself to focus. He had a job to do, and he wasn't going to let her get in his head this time. "Jamal," Miss Harper called out, glancing at her attendance sheet without making eye contact. "You're up." Jamal stood, gathering his notes as he made his way to the front of the room. His heart pounded in his chest, but he reminded himself of the hours he had invested in this presentation. He had the facts. He had the knowledge. He could do this. He started off strong, explaining the significance of the boycott, how it had marked a turning point in the civil rights movement. He spoke about Rosa Parks and her courageous act of resistance, how it had sparked a wave of protests across the country. As he delved deeper into the historical context, he could see some of his classmates nodding, clearly engaged with what he was saying. But then Miss Harper struck. "Hold on, Jamal," she interrupted, her voice cutting through his momentum like a knife. "Are you sure about that? Those statistics sound questionable." Jamal blinked, taken aback. He had double-checked his research. The numbers were accurate, the sources credible. "Yes, I'm sure," he replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "The boycott lasted for 381 days, and it resulted in—" Miss Harper interrupted again, leaning back in her chair with a smirk. "It seems like you're just repeating information you've read. Did you even bother to check if those sources are reliable?" Jamal's heart sank. He had cited reputable books, articles written by historians. There was nothing unreliable about his research. But before he could defend himself, Miss Harper continued. "Let's be honest, Jamal," she said, her voice laced with condescension. "It's not surprising that someone like you might struggle with a topic like this. These are complex issues. I wouldn't expect you to fully grasp the nuances." The room went silent. Jamal felt his breath catch in his throat. He could feel every eye in the classroom on him, the weight of their stares pressing down on him. Miss Harper's words hung in the air, cruel and biting. "Someone like you?" It wasn't subtle anymore. It was out in the open. Everyone in the room knew what she was implying. Jamal's hands trembled as he held onto his notes, trying to gather the strength to continue. He looked down, willing himself to stay composed. But his thoughts were swirling. How could she say something like that? How could she humiliate him in front of everyone? "Jamal, are you going to continue?" Miss Harper asked, her voice casual, as if she hadn't just thrown a blatant insult his way. "Or are we done here?" Jamal opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was blank, his confidence shattered. The presentation he had worked so hard on, the hours of preparation. It all felt pointless now. Miss Harper had stripped away any sense of pride he had in his work with just a few cruel sentences. The class remained still, the tension so thick it was almost suffocating. Jamal glanced around at his classmates, avoiding their gaze, their faces a mix of discomfort and shock. Some looked down at their desks, while others exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure of how to react. But no one spoke up. No one came to his defense. The silence in the room was deafening. Miss Harper stood up from her desk, crossing her arms as she stared at Jamal with a smug smile. "I think we've heard enough," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "It's clear you've put in some effort, but maybe next time you should focus on understanding the material rather than just memorizing facts." Jamal stood frozen, his mind racing, but his body unwilling to move. He had never felt so powerless, so utterly humiliated. The presentation had been his chance to prove himself, but now it felt like everything had fallen apart. Miss Harper glanced at the clock on the wall. "All right, class, let's move on," she said, completely dismissing Jamal and his work as though it didn't matter. "We'll discuss the next topic." But before she could finish, one of the students, a girl sitting near the back, spoke up. "Miss Harper, that was out of line." The room went dead silent again. Jamal looked up, shocked to hear someone standing up for him. It was Sarah, one of the quieter students in the class, someone who rarely spoke during discussions, but now her voice was clear and steady, cutting through the tension like a knife. Miss Harper raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting any pushback. "Excuse me? You were wrong to talk to him like that," Sarah said firmly, her face flushed but resolute. "Jamal's presentation was good. You didn't need to tear him down like that. And the way you said, someone like him, that was racist." The entire class seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Miss Harper's reaction. Jamal's heart raced. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. For the first time, someone had called out Miss Harper's behavior, and it was happening right in front of him. Miss Harper's expression darkened. "I think you're misunderstanding the situation," she said coldly, her voice sharp with irritation. "I was simply critiquing his presentation. There's no need to throw around accusations like that." But the class had already shifted. Other students began murmuring, exchanging whispers. Some nodded in agreement with Sarah, while others looked uncertain, clearly uncomfortable with the tension in the room. The air was thick with unspoken words, and for the first time, Jamal didn't feel completely alone. Miss Harper, sensing that she had lost control of the room, quickly moved on, pretending as if nothing had happened. But the damage was done. The incident lingered over the rest of the class like a dark cloud, and although Jamal remained silent inside, he felt something shift. For so long, he had been the target of Miss Harper's cruelty, but now, for the first time, someone had stood up for him. The weight of the moment lingered long after the bell rang, and as Jamal gathered his belongings to leave, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had finally changed. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, Jamal felt like maybe he wasn't fighting it alone. The classroom incident had left a mark, not just on Jamal but on his classmates as well. The tension had been so thick that day that no one could forget it, not even those who had remained silent during Miss Harper's cruel words. As Jamal walked out of class, still reeling from the humiliation, something unexpected began to happen. His peers, some of whom he barely knew, started to see the truth of what had been happening all along. No one had been blind to Miss Harper's behavior, but now, after witnessing it in such an undeniable way, they couldn't stay silent any longer. After the bell rang, Sarah, the girl who had spoken up in class, caught up with Jamal in the hallway. Her face was flushed, clearly still upset by what had happened. "Jamal!" she called out, her voice a little breathless. He turned, surprised to see her approaching. They had never really spoken much outside of class, but now her eyes were filled with determination. "I'm sorry about what happened today," she said, her voice steady but full of sympathy. "I just couldn't sit there and watch her treat you like that anymore. I've seen how she acts, and it's not okay." Jamal nodded, appreciating her words, but still feeling the sting of the day's events. "Thanks, Sarah. It means a lot that you stood up for me. I didn't think anyone noticed." "We noticed," a voice came from behind them. Jamal turned to see a few other classmates, people he'd exchanged polite nods with but never really spoken to. Among them were Daniel and Priya, both students who had always seemed too quiet to get involved in any drama. But now they were standing beside Sarah, with looks of quiet resolve on their faces. "Yeah," Daniel added, shifting his backpack as he spoke. "A lot of us have seen it, the way she talks to you, the way she singles you out. It's wrong, and after today, there's no way we can just ignore it." Jamal felt a flicker of hope. For so long, he had felt completely isolated, thinking he was the only one who could see Miss Harper's true colors. But here were his classmates, people he barely knew, offering their support. It felt surreal, but also like a weight was slowly lifting off his shoulders. "We're all behind you," Priya chimed in, her voice soft but full of conviction. "We've been talking, and some of us started recording her in class. We have proof of the things she's been saying to you, the racist comments, the way she treats you differently. If we can gather enough evidence, we can take it to the school board." Jamal's eyes widened in surprise. "You've been recording her?" Sarah nodded. "Yeah. After that last comment she made, it was clear that someone needed to step up. So a few of us decided to start documenting everything. If the school won't listen to one person, maybe they'll listen to a group of us." Jamal was stunned. The thought of his classmates coming together, not just to support him, but to take action, was something he hadn't expected. For so long, he had felt like he was fighting a battle he couldn't win. But now there was a glimmer of hope. His classmates were willing to risk their own comfort to stand up against Miss Harper's abuse. "What do we do next?" Jamal asked, his voice quiet but filled with a new sense of determination. "We need more evidence," Daniel said. "We've got a few recordings, but we'll need more if we're going to take this to the school board. She's smart. She won't say anything out in the open unless she thinks she can get away with it. But we'll catch her. We'll all work together." Jamal nodded, feeling a swell of gratitude and relief. He wasn't in this alone anymore. His classmates were rallying behind him, giving him the strength to keep going. For the first time in a long while, he felt like maybe, just maybe, justice was possible. Over the next few days, the group worked in secret. Students who had been silent during the initial confrontation began quietly joining the effort. They sat in the back of the class, their phones discreetly recording whenever Miss Harper spoke. They took notes on her behavior, compiling everything they could into a folder of evidence. Each day, more students began to see what was happening, and word spread quickly. By the end of the week, nearly half the class was involved in gathering proof of Miss Harper's racist and discriminatory actions. The tension in the classroom was palpable. Miss Harper, seemingly unaware of the rebellion brewing around her, continued to treat Jamal with the same disdain. She still interrupted his answers, still mocked his ideas, and still gave him grades far lower than he deserved. But now, every word she spoke, every condescending comment, was being carefully recorded. Jamal, while still hurt by her cruelty, felt a sense of empowerment, knowing that her words were no longer going unnoticed. One day after class, a small group of students met in the school library to review what they had gathered so far. Sarah, Daniel, and Priya were there, along with a few others who had helped with the recordings. They sat around a table, listening to the clips they had captured, their faces growing more serious with each passing minute. "Listen to this one," Sarah said, pressing play on her phone. Miss Harper's voice came through clearly, dripping with sarcasm as she responded to one of Jamal's answers during a class discussion. "Maybe if you'd paid more attention to history, you'd understand how things really work in this country," she had said, her words cutting like a knife. It was followed by the sound of silence in the classroom, the unmistakable weight of her comment hanging in the air. Priya shook her head, her expression one of disbelief. "I can't believe she's gotten away with this for so long." "We've got more than enough now," Daniel said, his voice firm. "We take this to the school board. They can't ignore it anymore." Jamal sat quietly, listening to the voices of his classmates, feeling a mix of emotions. He was still hurt by everything that had happened, still carrying the weight of Miss Harper's abuse, but now he didn't feel powerless. His classmates had given him the strength to keep fighting, to believe that something could be done. The next step was clear. They would present the evidence to the school board and demand action. It wouldn't be easy. Miss Harper was the principal's daughter, after all. But with the support of his peers, Jamal felt like he had a fighting chance. They were standing together now, and that solidarity meant everything. As the group finalized their plan, Jamal felt a sense of gratitude wash over him. He had come to this school with dreams, with hope for his future, and despite everything Miss Harper had tried to take from him, he still had that hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but he wasn't walking it alone anymore. His classmates were beside him, and together they would seek the justice that had been denied for far too long. The day finally arrived when Jamal and his classmates submitted their evidence to the school board. With recordings, notes, and witness statements gathered, they made a compelling case against Miss Harper. It had taken a lot of courage, but But Jamal now stood firm in his decision to hold her accountable. His classmates had given him the confidence to believe something could change, and now with their united effort, the wheels of justice had begun to turn. The school board wasted no time in launching an official investigation. For years, Miss Harper had built a reputation as a tough, no-nonsense teacher, but her behavior toward Jamal and potentially others needed to be reviewed in light of the allegations. The school buzzed with whispers and rumors as word spread about the complaint. Students from other classes began sharing their own stories of Miss Harper's unfair treatment, adding fuel to the growing controversy. But as the investigation gained traction, a shocking discovery emerged. Miss Harper wasn't just a regular teacher. She was the daughter of the school's principal, Mr. Harper. The news exploded like a bombshell through the student body. No one had known this before, not even the teachers or staff. It seemed Mr. Harper, the school's long-standing principal, had always been seen as a no-nonsense leader. He had earned a reputation for being strict, yes, but also for being fair. His office was a place students went when serious issues needed resolution, and he was regarded as someone who listened with impartiality. Now, however, people started wondering if that image of fairness had been a facade. Could it be that Miss Harper had been acting this way for so long because she believed she was above the rules? Had her father been protecting her all along, allowing her to continue unchecked, knowing full well what was happening under his roof? Rumors flew around the hallways. Some students speculated that Mr. Harper had known everything from the start, that he had turned a blind eye to his daughter's actions, covering up her racist and discriminatory behavior. Others were shocked, refusing to believe that a man who had always been seen as so principled would compromise his integrity to shield a family member. Jamal heard the rumors too, but he didn't want to jump to conclusions. It was hard enough coming to terms with the fact that Miss Harper was the principal's daughter. But thinking about Mr. Harper being complicit in everything? Well, that was a lot to process. The school board had kept him and the other students informed about the investigation, but they hadn't mentioned anything about Mr. Harper's involvement. Still, Jamal couldn't help but wonder if this was why no one had taken his complaint seriously before. Was the whole system rigged from the start? As the investigation continued, more details began to surface. Apparently, this wasn't the first time someone had complained about Miss Harper. Jamal learned that a few years earlier, a student had filed a grievance against her for inappropriate conduct, but nothing had come of it. The incident had been quietly brushed aside, the student discouraged from pursuing the matter further. Either back then, it hadn't made sense to anyone why the complaint had been so easily dismissed. Now, with the connection between Miss Harper and the principal exposed, it all began to add up. The pressure on the administration started to build. Parents were now getting involved, demanding answers from the school board. They wanted to know why this teacher had been allowed to continue for so long without facing any consequences. Was it true that her father had been protecting her? If so, what did that mean for the school's reputation and the safety of their children? Mr. Harper, who had long been seen as a pillar of the school's leadership, suddenly found himself at the center of a swirling controversy. Behind closed doors, the atmosphere was tense. Teachers who had once spoken highly of Miss Harper began to distance themselves. The faculty was divided. Some believed that this was all just a misunderstanding, that Miss Harper was being unfairly targeted because of her relationship to the principal. Others, however, saw the writing on the wall. They had known something wasn't right about her behavior for a long time, but had never felt empowered to speak up. Now, with the investigation moving forward, they felt free to voice their concerns, though many still did so anonymously. As for Mr. Harper, he remained tight-lipped, refusing to address the rumors directly. His silence only fueled more speculation. Was he trying to protect his daughter, or was he simply waiting for the investigation to conclude before making any statements? Either way, his inaction did little to calm the growing storm. Jamal watched all of this unfold with a mixture of emotions. On one hand, he felt vindicated. Finally, people were paying attention to the injustice he had faced. But on the other hand, he couldn't help but feel a strange sense of unease. If Mr. Harper really had been covering up for his daughter, what did that mean for the entire school? How many other students had suffered in silence because they knew their voices wouldn't be heard? One afternoon, Jamal received a message from one of the school board members inviting him to a private meeting. He wasn't sure what to expect, but knew it was important. When he arrived, the atmosphere in the room was serious. The board member, a composed and professional woman, greeted him with a firm handshake before getting straight to the point. "Jamal," she began, "we've been reviewing the evidence you and your classmates submitted, and I want to thank you for your bravery in coming forward. We're taking these allegations very seriously." Jamal nodded, his heart pounding in his chest as he sat down across from her. "We've also uncovered some disturbing information during our investigation," she continued. "It appears that there may have been a conflict of interest involving Miss Harper and the principal. We're looking into whether certain complaints against her were improperly handled." Jamal felt a knot form in his stomach. So Mr. Harper knew? The board member hesitated for a moment before answering. "We're still gathering all the facts, but it does seem that previous complaints were not pursued as they should have been. At this point, we're considering all possibilities, and we'll be holding a formal hearing to address these concerns." Jamal sat there, absorbing her words. The weight of the situation suddenly felt enormous. This wasn't just about him and Miss Harper anymore. It was about the integrity of the entire school administration. If the principal had been complicit in covering up his daughter's actions, it would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. As he left the meeting, Jamal couldn't help but think about how far things had come since that first day in Miss Harper's class. He had gone from being a victim of her bullying to standing at the center of a fight for justice, not just for himself but for everyone who had ever been mistreated or ignored. The stakes were higher than he had ever imagined, and though the road ahead would be difficult, he knew there was no turning back now. With the investigation deepening, the truth would soon come to light. And no matter how powerful Miss Harper or her father had seemed, their reign over the school was about to face its toughest test yet. As the investigation neared its conclusion, the pressure on Mr. Harper became unbearable. What had begun as a quiet inquiry into Miss Harper's classroom conduct had spiraled into a full-blown crisis, one that was drawing the attention of the entire school community and even the local media. Jamal's story was now more than just an isolated incident. It had become the catalyst for a much larger conversation about racism, bias, and accountability in education. The school board, having reviewed the evidence, now placed the burden of decision squarely on the shoulders of Mr. Harper. The school's reputation hung in the balance, and everyone was waiting to see what he would do. Mr. Harper had always taken pride in being a fair and disciplined principal. He was known for his ability to handle difficult situations with grace. But this was different. This wasn't just about a student or a teacher. This was about his own daughter. The evidence against Miss Harper was damning. The recordings, the testimonies, the pattern of behavior all painted a picture of a teacher who had abused her authority and targeted a student based on race. The racist comments, the condescension, and the public humiliation had been laid bare for everyone to see. There was no denying what had happened. Late one evening, Mr. Harper sat alone in his office, long after the halls had emptied and the lights had dimmed. The weight of the situation pressed down on him as he sifted through the files spread across his desk. Each piece of evidence, each student's statement, was another reminder of what his daughter had done. He had always known she could be a tough teacher, but he had never imagined it would come to this. How could he have been so blind? Was it his fault for not paying closer attention? Had his position as principal allowed her to feel untouchable, above the rules? He looked up at the family photo on his desk, his daughter smiling at him. Back when she had first started teaching, she had been so excited, then eager to make a difference in the lives of her students. But somewhere along the way, something had changed. He couldn't pinpoint when it happened, but the evidence was clear. Miss Harper had crossed a line, and now he had to make an impossible choice. The school board had made it clear that action needed to be taken, and fast. Parents were furious, demanding answers. They wanted to know how such blatant racism had gone unchecked for so long, and many were beginning to question Mr. Harper's leadership. Was he truly impartial, or had he been protecting his daughter all this time? The trust he had worked so hard to build was crumbling before his eyes. That morning, Mr. Harper had sat through a tense meeting with the school board who had laid out their expectations. They didn't outright tell him what to do, but the message was clear. Either he took action against his daughter, or the board would be forced to intervene. He knew what that meant. If he didn't handle this, his own job might be on the line. The school could not afford to have its principal caught up in a scandal of this magnitude. As the media began to pick up the story, Jamal's experience became the focal point of a much larger conversation about the role of educators in perpetuating racial bias. News outlets ran headlines like, "Racist teacher exposed at local high school," and "Principal faces tough choice between family and justice." The coverage was relentless. Parents were interviewed, students spoke out, and soon even local activists got involved, demanding accountability from the school administration. The pressure was mounting from all sides. In the midst of all this, Mr. Harper was also a father. He had raised his daughter, watched her grow, and supported her career every step of the way. The thought of what was about to happen filled him with a deep, gnawing guilt. He had always believed in second chances, in the ability of people to learn from their mistakes. But this wasn't something that could be swept under the rug. His daughter's actions had hurt students, had hurt Jamal, and had betrayed the values he had tried to instill in both his family and the school. The dilemma tore at him. Could he protect his daughter? Should he? The father in him wanted to shield her from the consequences, to believe that this was all a misunderstanding that could somehow be fixed. But the principal in him knew better. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the integrity of the school, about the message they were sending to the students, especially to those like Jamal, who had the courage to speak up against injustice. Later that week, the school board called a meeting with Mr. Harper and presented their findings from the investigation. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, the silence almost unbearable, as the board members laid out their conclusions. There was no denying the facts. Miss Harper had engaged in racist behavior, and her position as a teacher was now untenable. The question that remained was what Mr. Harper, as both the principal and her father, would do about it. The board president spoke firmly, but with understanding. "We realize this is a difficult situation for you, Mr. Harper, but the evidence is clear. Miss Harper's actions have violated the standards of this school and have caused harm to the students under her care. We need to know how you plan to address this." Mr. Harper, who had remained silent throughout the presentation, finally spoke. His voice was steady, but there was a deep sadness in his eyes. "I understand the gravity of the situation," he said, his words measured. "My daughter's actions are inexcusable, and as her father, it breaks my heart to see the pain she has caused. But as the principal of this school, I have a duty to uphold the values we stand for: fairness, respect, and the safety of all students. I cannot and will not allow anyone, even my own family, to undermine those principles." The room remained silent as Mr. Harper continued. His tone was steady, but everyone could feel the emotional toll it had taken on him. This school has always been a place where students are meant to feel safe, respected, and empowered to achieve their dreams. That trust was broken, and while we have taken steps to correct it, I know that my position as principal has been compromised. It is for this reason that I have decided to step down. Gasps and whispers filled the room. For a moment, no one had expected the once-admired principal to resign, but Mr. Harper knew that for the school to heal, for it to move forward, his departure was necessary. His choice was the ultimate act of accountability, a statement that even those in power must answer for their failings. With his resignation, Miss Harper's fate was also sealed. The board confirmed her termination effective immediately. She was to be barred from teaching at the school and any other institutions within the district. It was a necessary action, but a bittersweet one. Though justice was being served, it came at the cost of a family's bond and reputation. In the wake of these decisions, the school took rapid steps to rebuild trust. New policies were introduced to prevent discrimination and bullying, including anti-racism training for all staff members. The administration, now under new leadership, established clear channels for students to report harassment, ensuring that future complaints would be taken seriously and handled with care. Amid these changes, Jamal found himself at the center of a growing movement within the school. His courage had inspired his peers to take a stand, and the support he had received from his classmates had brought about real change. But while the outcome had led to Miss Harper's dismissal and new policies, the journey had not been an easy one for Jamal. He had endured emotional wounds that would take time to heal. Yet through it all, he remained resilient, a quiet but powerful symbol of perseverance. A few weeks later, the school invited Jamal to speak at a special assembly, organized in response to the recent events. It was a pivotal moment, not just for Jamal but for the entire school community. The assembly hall was packed with students, teachers, and parents, all eager to hear Jamal's story firsthand. Standing at the podium, Jamal took a deep breath. His heart raced, but he reminded himself why he was there. This was not just about telling his story. It was about ensuring no one else had to endure what he had. The silence in the room was deafening as he began to speak, his voice clear and steady. "I stand here today," he said, "not because I wanted to, but because I had to. For months, I sat in silence while someone in a position of power treated me as less than simply because of the color of my skin. I didn't want to speak up. I didn't want to cause trouble. But there comes a point where staying silent is no longer an option. When we stay quiet in the face of injustice, we allow it to continue." Jamal's words hung in the air, and the audience was completely captivated. He went on to recount his experiences, the subtle slights that had slowly turned into blatant racism, and the internal struggle he faced about whether to report it. He spoke of the loneliness he had felt, the moments when he doubted himself, but also the strength he found through the support of his classmates. "I wasn't alone," Jamal continued, glancing at the faces of his friends in the crowd. "When I thought no one would listen, there were people who stood up with me, and because of that, we made a change. This isn't just my story, it's our story. It's about all of us standing together to make sure that no one else has to go through what I went through." The room erupted into applause, not just for Jamal's bravery, but for the unity his story had fostered among the students. In that moment, Jamal wasn't just the victim of a racist teacher. He had become a voice for change, a symbol of resilience, and a source of hope for anyone who had ever felt marginalized or powerless. As the school year continued, Jamal's story remained a powerful reminder of the impact one person can have when they refuse to back down. His experience had sparked a broader conversation about racism and inequality, not just in the school but in the community as a whole. And for Jamal, there was a sense of closure, though the scars of what he had endured would never fully fade. On the day of graduation, Jamal stood in his cap and gown, looking out at the sea of faces in the audience. His heart swelled with pride. This moment, crossing the stage to receive his diploma, felt like a victory, not just for him, but for every student who had ever felt unseen or unheard. As his name was called, the crowd erupted into cheers, his classmates clapping the loudest. Walking across the stage, Jamal realized something profound. Despite the obstacles, the racism, the moments of self-doubt, he had achieved his goal. He had never given up on his dream of becoming a doctor, and now he stood one step closer to making that dream a reality. As he reached out to shake hands with the new principal, there was a moment of unspoken acknowledgement, a nod to everything he had overcome and to the brighter future that lay ahead. Jamal looked out into the audience once more, knowing that his journey was just beginning. But no matter what the future held, he knew one thing for certain. He had stood up, he had fought for what was right, and in the end, he had won. As the credits rolled on this chapter of Jamal's life, the message was clear. Justice had been served and redemption was found, not just for Jamal, but for an entire community that had rallied behind him. Thank you for watching the story. If you enjoyed it and believe in standing up against injustice, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for more inspiring stories, and don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below.